She thought the fire would take everything, until a stranger changed her life forever. The year was 1889, a time when dust rose higher than dreams, and men rode with ghosts they never spoke of. The land was wild, stitched together by long trails, broken fences, and hearts that had forgotten how to heal. Through that silence rode Colo Hayes, a man carved by war and weather. His horse moved steady beneath him, hooves striking rhythm against the dry earth. No home behind him, no promise ahead, only the wind and the endless road through Willow Creek Valley. People said Colo once had a family, a wife, a boy. But time had a cruel way of stealing names, faces, and reasons to keep on hoping. Now he just drifted from one lonely town to another, fixing what was broken until the ache in his chest became too heavy to bear. Then he'd move on again. That evening, the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in sorrowful orange. Colo spotted something unusual, a thin column of smoke twisting upward, not from a chimney, but from the edge of a small homestead. He hesitated. Trouble was the one thing he'd promised himself to avoid. But something, maybe instinct, maybe mercy, pulled his reins left. When he reached the yard, he found a woman fighting a small fire beside her barn. Her sleeves were rolled, her hands blistered, her breath coming hard. She struck at the flames with a shovel, alone, desperate, losing. Without a word, Colo leapt off his horse, grabbed a bucket from the well, and joined her. Together they threw dirt and water until the fire coughed out its last ember. The woman stood there, trembling, sweat streaking her face. Her eyes met his, tired but strong, like someone who had weathered too many storms. "Thank you, stranger," she whispered. "Thought I was going to lose everything." Colo set the bucket down. "Fire travels fast inland this dry," he said quietly. "You got anyone to help?" She shook her head. "No, just me and my little girl. My husband passed last winter." The words fell heavy between them. Colo didn't answer, didn't know how. But he understood the kind of loneliness that lived behind her eyes. A small voice piped up from behind the fence. "Mama, who's that man?" A little girl, no more than 6, peered out, her golden curls messy, and her hands clutching a small wooden doll. Mercy smiled faintly at her child. "He's just a traveler, sweetheart." A kind one. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of burnt hay and something tender, the faintest beginning of trust. Colo looked around the weary homestead. A barn half burned, fences sagging, and 2 souls trying to survive in a world that had already taken too much. "I can help fix the damage," he said at last. Mercy blinked, startled. "You do that for a stranger?" Colo gave a small nod. "Sometimes, ma'am. Strangers are the only ones who still care." And so began the story of Willow Creek. Not a legend carved in stone, but a truth whispered in the wind, about a lonely man, a brave woman, and the quiet way love finds its way home. The next morning broke soft and golden over Willow Creek. Dew clung to the grass like tiny glass beads, and the burnt edge of the barn still smoked faintly. Colo had slept outside beneath the oak tree, his hat tipped over his eyes, the ground his only bed. When the rooster crowed, he was already awake, rolling his bedroll tight. But before he could mount his horse, Mercy's voice called out, gentle and unsure. "Mr. Hayes?" He turned. She stood on the porch, shawl around her shoulders, a steaming tin cup in her hands. "You don't have to go so early," she said. "You could stay for breakfast." "It's the least I can do for your help," Colo hesitated. He wasn't used to staying. He was the kind of man who left before the world remembered his face. But something about her tone, polite, kind, but laced with loneliness, made him nod. He tied his horse to the post and followed her inside. The house was small but clean. There were hand-sewn curtains, a half-finished quilt on a chair, and the smell of cornbread baking in the old iron oven. Mercy poured him coffee while her daughter, Annie, watched him curiously from across the table. "Clutching her little doll, do you fix barns for a living?" Annie asked in her small, serious voice. Colo smiled faintly, the first real smile he'd felt in years. "No, miss. I just fix what's broken when I can," Annie tilted her head. "Mama says only kind men do that." Mercy's cheeks colored. "Annie," she whispered, "eat your bread." But Kolo only nodded, his eyes soft. "Your mama's right." After breakfast, Kolo went outside and studied the barn's damage. The fire had burned half the roof, blackened one wall and weakened the beams. It would take days, maybe weeks, to rebuild. He rolled up his sleeves and got to work. Mercy tried to protest. "You've done enough already." "I can't pay you," he shook his head. "Didn't ask for pay, but why?" she whispered. Kolo paused, hammer in hand. "Because somebody once helped me when I had nothing left. Guess I've been trying to return the favor ever since." For a long moment, she didn't answer. She just watched him, the way his rough hands moved with quiet purpose, the way he worked without complaint, as if labor was a kind of prayer. Days passed like that. Kolo repaired the barn, mended the fences, fixed the roof. Annie followed him everywhere, asking questions, bringing him water, laughing, a sound that began to fill the empty corners of the homestead. One evening, as the sun sank low, Mercy brought him supper outside, stew, warm bread, and a shy smile. "You've done more for us than anyone in this valley," she said softly. "I don't know how to thank you." Kolo looked at the fields, the fading light painting everything gold. "You already did," he murmured. "You gave me a place to belong, even if just for a while." Mercy's eyes glistened. For the first time in months, she didn't feel alone. Neither did he. And somewhere deep in the heart of Willow Creek, something began to heal. Days melted into weeks, and life at the Langdon farm began to change. The barn stood tall again, its new roof gleaming under the sun. The fences were straight, the well cleaned, and laughter, small and shy, had found its way back into Mercy's home. Kolo never asked for more than a place to sleep by the barn and a plate at the table. He worked from dawn to dusk, his presence quiet but steady, like a mountain that asked for nothing yet gave shelter. To Annie, he became a hero. To Mercy, something she could not yet name. One late afternoon, Mercy stood by the porch watching him work, the golden light brushing across his face. He looked strong, sure, and yet there was a sadness about him, the kind that never quite fades. Annie ran toward him, giggling, her little boots kicking up dust. "Mr. Kolo!" "Look, I found a bird's nest," she said, cupping her hands. Kolo crouched down, inspecting the tiny nest with its speckled eggs. "You take care of that, Miss Annie," he said softly. "World's got too few gentle hands left." Mercy smiled from the porch, but her peace didn't last. A sound, distant but harsh, cut through the evening calm. Hooves, several of them. Her heart tightened. She recognized that sound. A group of men on horseback rode toward the homestead, kicking up trails of dust. At the front rode Jed Tanner, the neighboring rancher, a broad, cruel man known for his temper and greed. "Stay close to your mama," Kolo said quietly, rising to his full height as the riders approached. Jed reined in his horse near the gate, his smirk sharp as a blade. "Well, well, didn't think you'd make it through the winter, Mercy," he said, his voice slick with mockery. "Heard you lost the barn. Thought I'd come by and offer to buy this land before it wastes away." Mercy straightened, her hands trembling only slightly. "The land's not for sale, Mr. Tanner. You've made your offer before." "My answer hasn't changed." Jed's eyes flicked to Kolo. "And who's this? Another drifter? You sure got company fast." Kolo's jaw tightened. "Just lending a hand, mister. Best you move on." Jed's smile turned mean. "Careful, stranger. Not everyone around here likes outsiders." The air between them grew heavy. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Jed spat on the ground, tugged his reins, and turned his horse. "This ain't over, Mercy," he growled. "You can't run a farm alone forever." When they were gone, Mercy exhaled shakily. Her voice wavered. "He's been after this land since before my husband died. Claims he owns half the creek, but the papers say otherwise." Kolo looked out toward the horizon where the riders disappeared. "Men like him don't stop easy," he murmured. "But I'll be here, long as you'll have me." Mercy met his eyes, steady, kind, unafraid, and something unspoken passed between them. Not promise. Not yet, but trust. And maybe, just maybe, the first spark of love. The next few days passed in uneasy quiet. The land around Willow Creek looked peaceful. Golden fields, singing crickets, gentle winds. Yet Mercy could not shake the feeling of eyes watching from the distance. Jed Tanner's visit had stirred an old fear inside her. She'd seen that look before, in the way greedy men glanced at her land, and sometimes at her. Kolo noticed her silence, though he didn't speak of it. He worked harder than before, fixing the corral, chopping wood, walking the fence line at dusk as though guarding it. Mercy saw it too, the way he scanned the horizon each evening before settling near the barn. One night, as the lantern flickered low, she stepped outside with a shawl around her shoulders. Kolo was sitting on the porch steps, whittling a piece of wood into the shape of a small bird. Annie was asleep, and the house was quiet except for the soft hum of night crickets. "You don't rest much, do you?" she asked gently. He smiled faintly. "Never learned how. War?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Takes a man apart piece by piece. You get used to keeping watch." She sat beside him, the wooden porch creaking under their weight. "You don't have to watch over us all night, Kolo. You've done more than enough." He looked out at the stars. "You and Annie remind me what peace sounds like. I reckon I don't want anyone taking that away." Mercy's eyes softened. "You're a good man." He shook his head slightly. "Just trying to be." The silence that followed was tender, the kind that didn't need words. But peace, as always, didn't last long in Willow Creek. The next afternoon, while Mercy and Annie hung laundry behind the house, they heard a sudden crash, glass shattering from inside. Mercy ran to the front porch, heart pounding. A rock lay on the floor, shattered a window. A note was tied around it. She picked it up with trembling hands and read the scrawled words. "Sell the land or regret it." J.T. Mercy's knees weakened. For a moment, old fear washed through her like cold water. But before it could take root, Kolo's voice came low and calm behind her. "Let me see it." He read the note, his jaw tightening, eyes dark as storm clouds. "He won't lay a hand on you," he said, his voice steady. "Not while I'm here." Mercy tried to smile, though her voice trembled. "You can't fight a whole gang, Kolo." He looked at her, and for a moment she saw something raw in his eyes, a promise carved deep as stone. "I've fought worse for less reason," he said simply. "I'll fix the window. You get Annie inside." That night Mercy couldn't sleep. She watched from the window as Kolo walked the perimeter of the property, a lantern in one hand, his rifle slung low across his shoulder. The light moved slow and steady, like a guardian's flame. For the first time since her husband's death, she didn't feel alone. She felt safe. The night fell darker than usual, thick clouds swallowing the moon. The air was still, too still, the kind of silence that made even the crickets hide. Inside the small farmhouse, Mercy tucked Annie into bed, her heart uneasy. She could feel something in the air, a heaviness pressing against her chest. Outside, Kolo moved quietly along the edge of the barn, lantern dimmed, rifle in hand. He'd seen enough of men like Jed Tanner to know what they were capable of. Words like threats were just smoke before the fire. Hours passed. Then in the far distance, faint but certain, came the sound he'd been waiting for. Hoofbeats, slow at first, then faster. More than one horse. He moved toward the porch, crouched low, and watched as 3 shadowy figures emerged from the tree line, their torches flickering. Mercy appeared behind him, clutching her shawl. "Kolo," she whispered, voice trembling. "They're here," he turned, eyes steady. "Keep Annie inside. No matter what happens, I won't leave you out there." But he cut her off softly. "You already lost too much, Mercy. Not tonight." Before she could argue, he was gone, melting into the darkness like he was born from it. The riders stopped near the barn. One of them, tall, broad, swung off his horse. Even in the dim light, Kolo knew that stance. "Jed Tanner. Well, boys," Jed drawled, his voice thick with whiskey. "Looks like the widow's got herself a guard dog. Let's see if he bites." Kolo stepped out from behind the fence, rifle raised. "Leave now, Tanner." "You're trespassing," Jed laughed. "That your land, stranger?" "Last I checked, this valley don't belong to you." Kolo didn't flinch. "Ain't about land. It's about decency. Something you wouldn't recognize if it bit you." Jed's smirk vanished. You think you can scare me off? No, Kolo said quietly, but I can sure make you regret coming here. For a tense moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then one of Jed's men reached for his gun, and a single warning shot split the night. The bullet struck the dirt inches from his boots. Kolo's voice was calm as stone. Next one won't miss, Jed cursed under his breath. You ain't worth hanging for, Hayes, but mark my words, this ain't over. He swung onto his horse and spat in the dirt before galloping off, the others following. Their torches disappeared into the night, leaving only silence behind. Kolo stood still for a long time, rifle in hand, until the sound of hooves faded completely. When he finally turned, Mercy was standing on the porch, tears glimmering in her eyes. You could have been killed, she whispered. He lowered the rifle. So could you. Something broke softly inside her. Fear, grief, maybe the wall she'd built around her heart. She stepped toward him, her voice trembling. Why would you risk your life for us? Kolo looked at her for a long moment. The wind tugged at his coat, carrying the faint scent of smoke and wild sage. Because, he said quietly, this place finally feels like home. Mercy's breath caught, not from fear, but from something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. Hope. By the time dawn rolled over Willow Creek, the world had gone quiet again. A pink glow touched the horizon, soft and trembling, as if the land itself was finally exhaling. Mercy hadn't slept a moment. She sat by the window all night, watching Kolo's shadow move across the yard. When he finally came inside, his steps were slow. His shirt torn at the shoulder, a dark stain spreading where the bullet had grazed him. Oh, Kolo, she whispered, rushing toward him. You're hurt. It's nothing, he muttered, but his voice faltered when she guided him gently to a chair. It's something, she said firmly. Sit still. She fetched a basin of warm water and tore a clean strip from an old bedsheet. Kolo sat silently as she cleaned the wound, her hands steady despite the tremor in her chest. The lantern's glow cast a soft circle of light over them, two souls who'd both forgotten what it meant to be cared for. When the cloth touched his skin, he flinched slightly. Mercy paused. I'm sorry. Does it hurt? He shook his head. Just been a while since someone worried about me. Their eyes met, hers filled with quiet compassion. His with something deeper, something unspoken. You shouldn't have faced them alone, she whispered. He gave a half smile. Didn't figure I was alone, Mercy's heart tightened. She wanted to tell him how much his presence meant, how his quiet strength had brought safety back into their lives. But the words caught in her throat. Instead, she said softly, you've done enough work for 10 men. You should rest, Kolo's gaze softened. I'll rest when this place don't need protecting. Mercy dipped the cloth again, wrung it out, and pressed it gently against his shoulder. Maybe, she said, her voice barely a whisper, we could protect it together. For a moment the world seemed to still. The crackle of the fire, the soft sound of Annie's breathing from the other room, it all blended into a tender silence that neither wanted to break. When she was done, she tied the cloth around his wound, her fingers brushing his skin. He looked down at her hands, gentle, capable, and warm. Thank you, he said quietly. Mercy smiled faintly. You keep saving us. Let me save you once in a while. Outside, the first light of day painted the valley in gold. Birds began to sing again, cautious but hopeful. Annie appeared in the doorway, her little eyes sleepy. Mama, Mr. Kolo? Mercy turned. It's all right, sweetheart. Go back to bed. Annie shook her head and toddled toward Kolo. You're bleeding, she said, her tiny hand resting on his arm. I'll pray so you get better. Kolo's rough features softened completely. That means more than you know, little one. Mercy watched the two of them together. The strong man who carried the weight of the world, and the little girl who saw only kindness in him, and her heart swelled with something fragile and beautiful. It wasn't just gratitude anymore. It was the beginning of love. The days after the storm brought a new kind of calm to Willow Creek, one that felt almost sacred. The gunfire, the fear, the loneliness, all of it seemed to fade like a bad dream. Each morning, Mercy would step outside to find Kolo already awake, splitting wood or mending the fence with quiet determination. The sound of his axe striking the log echoed through the valley, strong, steady, dependable. Annie would sit on the porch steps, her small chin resting in her palms, watching him with the wide-eyed wonder only a child could have. One morning she called out, "Mr. Kolo, can I help you today?" Kolo paused mid-swing, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Well now, reckon you can carry kindlin' if you don't mind getting a bit of dirt on those little hands." Annie giggled. "Mama says dirt. Means you're working hard." "That's the truth," Kolo replied, nodding solemnly. Mercy stood by the doorway, her apron dusted with flour, watching the scene with quiet warmth. It had been so long since laughter had filled their home. The sound of it made her heart ache in the sweetest way. Later that afternoon, while Mercy baked bread, she caught a glimpse of Kolo and Annie near the barn. Annie was sitting atop a small wooden crate, her hands gripping an old brush as Kolo taught her how to groom the horse. "You gotta be gentle," he said softly, guiding her little hands. "Horses feel more than most folks think." Annie nodded seriously. "Like Mama?" Kolo chuckled. "A bit like your mama, yeah." When Mercy stepped out with a basket of warm bread, the sight stopped her in her tracks. The tall, quiet man teaching her daughter with patience and care, the golden sunlight pouring around them like a blessing. She blinked quickly, brushing away a tear. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, they all sat on the porch together. The air smelled of pine and smoke, the sky painted in shades of amber and rose. Kolo sat on the steps, cleaning his old revolver while Mercy and Annie shared a small quilt on the bench. "Mr. Kolo," Annie asked, "why don't you live with anyone?" Kolo's hands paused. He looked out toward the fields. "Sometimes life takes you far from people, and before you know it, you forget what home feels like." Annie frowned. "You can stay here. Then you don't have to forget anymore." Kolo looked at her, then at Mercy, whose eyes softened, shining in the firelight. He gave a slow nod. "Maybe I will." The stars began to appear, one by one, scattering across the velvet sky. Mercy leaned back, feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. The kind that came not from safety, but from belonging. That night, when the world grew quiet and Annie was asleep, Mercy stood by the window, watching Kolo place his hat by the door before turning in. Her heart whispered what her lips couldn't yet say. He didn't just bring safety, he brought life back to us. Autumn drifted softly over Willow Creek. The air grew crisp, and the leaves turned from green to gold, spinning gently down the hillsides like old promises returning to the earth. Mercy found herself standing on the porch one evening. Arms wrapped around her shawl as the wind carried the scent of wood smoke. Kolo was out by the corral, fixing a broken gate hinge. His movements were calm, methodical, the kind of patience born from years of solitude. She watched him for a long moment before walking down the steps, her boots crunching softly over the gravel. "You never stop working," she said, her voice carrying a smile. He looked up. "Work keeps a man's thoughts quiet," Mercy tilted her head. "And what happens when the work's done?" Kolo paused, wiping his hands on a rag. "Then the thoughts come back." She stood beside him, leaning lightly on the fence. The silence stretched between them, not awkward, but heavy with something unspoken. After a moment she said quietly, "You lost someone once, didn't you?" His shoulders stiffened. He didn't look at her, just kept his gaze on the fading horizon. "A long time ago," he said softly. "Wife and a boy. Fever took 'em both in one winter." Mercy's breath caught. "I'm so sorry," he gave a slow nod. "That's when I left everything behind. Thought if I kept riding, maybe the road would take the pain with it." Her hand tightened on the fence. "Did it?" He looked at her then, eyes weary but honest. "No, the road just got longer." Mercy swallowed hard. "I lost my husband, too. Bandits came through 3 years back. I thought moving out here would make it easier. But every night I hear his boots on the porch in my dreams." For a moment the wind sighed between them. carrying away the words they couldn't say aloud. "I guess we've both been haunted," Kolo murmured. She nodded slowly. "Maybe that's why we understand each other." He turned, leaning one arm on the fence post. "You ever think some folks were meant to cross paths, just so the hurt in one heart could quiet the other?" Mercy looked up at him, her eyes glistening. "I do now." The world around them seemed to fade, the rustling leaves, the creaking fence, the distant call of a lone coyote, all softened by the moment's fragile stillness. Then Annie's laughter rang from the porch, breaking the spell. She came running with a basket in her hands. "Mama, Mr. Kolo? Supper's ready." Kolo smiled faintly. "Can't keep the little one waiting." Mercy returned the smile, her chest full of warmth and ache. As they walked back toward the light spilling from the cabin windows, she realized something quietly miraculous. The past no longer felt like a chain. It felt like soil, and maybe, just maybe, something new was beginning to grow from it. The first frost of winter came early that year. Willow Creek turned silver overnight, fields dusted with frost, the air sharp enough to sting the lungs. The creek itself whispered beneath a thin layer of ice, and smoke rose steady from Mercy's chimney each morning like a promise of warmth. Kolo stayed. He never said the words, but his presence told its own story. He fixed fences, repaired the barn roof, and taught Annie how to tie knots and care for the animals. What had once been a lonely homestead slowly became a home again. One morning, Mercy found him chopping wood near the porch, his breath clouding the cold air. She handed him a mug of coffee, her hands wrapped around it to keep them warm. "Hard to believe you've been here almost 3 months," she said softly. He took the mug, nodding. "Feels shorter, feels right," she smiled, watching the steam rise between them. "Annie's taken to you like you've always been here." Kolo gave a low chuckle. "She's got more fire in her than most grown men I know. Reminds me what it's like to laugh again." Mercy looked down at the snow beneath her boots, her voice barely above a whisper. "She laughs because she feels safe." Their eyes met, the kind of look that held everything neither dared to speak. Inside, Annie was humming as she helped set the table for breakfast. She peeked out the window and grinned. "Mama," she called, "are you and Mr. Kolo going to get married?" Mercy nearly dropped the flower bowl. "Annie!" Kolo laughed quietly from outside. Mercy's cheeks turned pink, half from the cold and half from something warmer blooming within her. Later that afternoon, the three of them worked side by side repairing the chicken coop that had nearly fallen apart after last season's storms. Annie held the nails, Kolo hammered, and Mercy passed him the boards. "You're a good team," Mercy said, smiling. Kolo looked up from his work. "Only because we've got a good leader." Mercy blushed and shook her head. "Oh, I doubt that." But he said it again, slower this time, his tone carrying more weight. "You lead with kindness, Mercy. That's rarer than you think," her breath caught. No one had said words like that to her in years. By the time evening came, snow had started to fall, soft, thick flakes drifting lazily through the air. Mercy lit the oil lamps while Annie curled up under a blanket by the fire. Kolo stood near the window, watching the snow settle over the land. "This place," he said quietly, "feels like it's healing me." Mercy turned toward him. "Maybe it's not just the place," she said. He looked at her, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. "Maybe it's the people." Outside, the snow kept falling, soft, endless, pure, covering the scars of the land, just as love had begun to cover the scars in their hearts. By late January, winter had sunk its teeth deep into Willow Creek. The mountains loomed white and silent, and each morning the windows were laced with frost, like thin veins of glass. Mercy had lived through many winters, but this one felt different, colder, heavier, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Kolo had been stacking wood near the barn when he noticed the sky. It was the kind of gray that didn't move, heavy, low, and full of warning. He dropped the last log and hurried inside. "Mercy," he said, brushing snow from his coat. "Storm's coming. A bad one." She looked up from the hearth where she'd been stirring soup. "How bad?" "Bad enough to keep us in for days." "I'll bring the animals in closer, tighten the barn doors." Mercy nodded, her heart tightening. "I'll get more water inside." "Annie, sweetheart, help me with the buckets." By sundown, the wind had begun to howl. The cabin shuddered beneath its weight. Snow slammed against the windows and the world beyond disappeared into a blur of white. Annie clung to Mercy's skirt. "Mama, is it going to break the house?" Mercy knelt and brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "No, darling. Mr. Colo built it strong." Colo gave her a small smile from across the room as he stoked the fire higher. "Ain't nothing going to touch you two while I'm here." But by midnight the wind grew wild, tearing shingles from the roof, rattling the shutters like angry ghosts. The cold crept through the cracks, biting their skin. Colo moved fast, reinforcing the door with a heavy beam while Mercy wrapped Annie in every blanket she could find. When a branch smashed against the window, Annie screamed. Mercy held her close, whispering soothing words. Colo crossed the room and crouched beside them, his voice low and steady. "Hey, little one. You're safe. Just the wind trying to scare us." Mercy looked at him, the flicker of firelight carving shadows across his rugged face, his eyes soft and certain. She realized then how much his presence steadied her, how much trust she'd placed in him without even meaning to. Hours passed. Annie drifted into uneasy sleep by the fire. Mercy sat nearby, rubbing warmth into her small hands. Colo sat opposite, exhaustion lining his face. "You should rest," she whispered. He shook his head. "Not while that wind's still talking. You can't protect us from the sky, Colo." He looked at her, his gaze deep and raw. "Maybe not, but I can be the wall it breaks against." For a long moment neither spoke. The storm raged outside, but inside the small cabin, a quiet warmth began to bloom, fragile, but real. Mercy reached across the space between them, her fingers brushing his rough hand. "Then we'll face it together," she said softly. He didn't answer. He just closed his hand gently around hers. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, two hearts finally found their shelter. When morning finally came, the storm had gone quiet. The world outside was buried under a thick, glistening blanket of white. Every fence post, every tree branch bowed beneath the weight of the snow, sparkling under a pale sun that had fought its way through the gray. Mercy opened her eyes slowly, her body still curled beside Annie, who was fast asleep by the fireplace. The cabin was cold but standing, a small miracle after the night they'd endured. Colo was already up feeding the fire. His movements were slow but sure, his breath visible in the frosty air. He turned when he heard her stir. "You all right?" Mercy nodded, her voice soft. "We made it," he smiled faintly. "Told you we would." When she stood, her legs trembled. Colo caught her elbow before she could fall. His touch was steady, warm even through the chill. "Careful now," he murmured. "Just tired," she whispered, glancing up at him. Their eyes held for a moment longer than they should have, the kind of gaze that spoke more than words ever could. After breakfast, little more than bread and broth, Colo bundled up and stepped outside to check the damage. Mercy watched through the window as he trudged through the deep snow, his figure a dark silhouette against the white world. He moved with quiet strength, checking the barn, freeing the horses, clearing paths with a shovel. Annie came to her side, tugging at her sleeve. "Mama, he's like a hero," Mercy smiled softly. "Yes, sweetheart, he is." Hours later, Colo came back inside, his face flushed from the cold. "Barn's standing, animals are fine," he said, brushing snow from his coat. "We'll need to fix a few things when the thaw comes, but we're safe." Mercy exhaled in relief. "I don't know what we'd have done without you." Colo looked at her, his tone low. "You'd have done just fine." "You're stronger than you think, Mercy." Her lips parted as if to speak, but she couldn't find the words. Instead, she reached for his scarf, still damp from snow, and hung it near the fire to dry. "Even strong people need someone sometimes," she said quietly. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. Maybe that's true. That evening, as twilight painted the snow in shades of rose and violet, the three of them sat close to the fire. Annie drew pictures in the soot on the hearthstone, clumsy shapes of a house, a woman, a child, and a tall man beside them. "Mama," she said proudly, pointing, "that's us." Mercy's eyes softened. "It's beautiful." Colo leaned forward, smiling. Guess I look taller in your drawings than I do in real life, Annie giggled.
Mercy laughed too, really laughed, for the first time in years. In that laughter, in that tiny flicker of peace after so much pain, something inside Kolo broke open. He looked at the two of them, and the realization struck like sunlight after a long night. He wasn't just protecting them anymore. He belonged to them. By late March, the snow began to loosen its grip on Willow Creek. What was once a world of white started to soften into color again, tender blades of green pushing through the thawing soil, the steady murmur of the creek returning beneath the melting ice. For Mercy, it felt as if life itself was waking up. She found herself humming while tending to chores, laughter coming more easily, sleep feeling less heavy. Annie spent her days chasing birds and splashing in puddles, her joy echoing across the valley, and Kolo. He was still there. Still rising before dawn, still repairing what the winter had broken, still keeping quiet watch over both of them. But something between him and Mercy had changed. It wasn't just gratitude now. It wasn't just safety. It was gentleness, the kind that grows slowly, like sunlight spreading across the land after a long storm. One morning, Mercy brought him a loaf of fresh bread she'd baked herself. "Thought you could use this," she said, brushing flour from her hands. He looked up from the fence he was mending and smiled softly. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Their hands brushed when he took the bread. Neither pulled away. Days passed in the rhythm of simple, shared living, planting seeds, repairing fences, preparing for spring. Kolo taught Annie how to ride the small brown mare he'd gentled over winter. Mercy stood by the fence, her heart full, watching them laugh under the open sky. One evening, after Annie had gone to bed, Mercy stepped outside to find Kolo sitting on the porch steps, his hat resting beside him. The sky was awash in orange and purple, the air cool and sweet with the scent of thawing earth. She sat beside him in silence. After a while, Kolo spoke. "This place, it's different now," Mercy glanced at him. "Different how?" He turned his gaze toward the horizon. "Feels alive again. Feels like it belongs to someone who believes in it." Her lips curved into a faint smile. "Maybe that's what happens when people stop running from their pain." He nodded slowly. "You helped me stop running, Mercy." She looked at him, really looked at him. The lines of his face, the steady kindness in his eyes, the quiet strength in his silence. "And you helped me remember what safety feels like." For a long moment, they just sat there, two souls scarred by loss, now finding peace in the stillness between them. The first fireflies began to flicker in the dusk. Mercy reached over, her fingers finding his. He didn't speak, didn't move, just turned his hand so their palms fit together. Neither said the word love. They didn't need to. It was already there, in the warmth of their hands, the quiet of the land, and the way both their hearts had finally begun to heal. Spring deepened over Willow Creek, and the valley bloomed with wildflowers, golden buttercups, soft lavender, and pale blue forget-me-nots scattered like fallen stars across the meadow. The land was alive again, but deep down, Kolo felt a stirring he hadn't known in months. The whisper of the road, the pull of old habits that refused to die. One afternoon, while checking the fence line near the ridge, a rider appeared on the trail, a lean man with a worn hat and dust-covered boots. Kolo recognized him before the man even spoke. "Kolo," the stranger said, reining in his horse. "Didn't think I'd ever see you settled." Kolo's voice was steady, but something inside him tensed. "Been a long time, Mason," Mason nodded. "Heard you were out here. Folks talk. Said you put an end to the Carter gang. The law's looking for a man like you, to wear a badge this time, not run from one." Kolo frowned. "I'm no lawman. You were once," Mason reminded him, "before the fever took your family. Before you walked away." Kolo looked out toward the valley, the cabin roof shining in the sunlight, a small figure, Annie, chasing a butterfly near the fence, Mercy hanging clothes on the line. His heart ached at the sight. "I ain't that man anymore," he said quietly. Mason leaned forward in his saddle. "You could be again.
You got a chance to do something right, Kolo. Maybe that's what you've been waiting for. The words lingered like smoke after gunfire. That evening, Kolo was quieter than usual. Mercy noticed it at once. He barely touched his supper, and when Annie went to bed, he sat staring into the fire, lost in thought. She sat beside him, her voice gentle. "Something's troubling you." He didn't look up. "An old friend came by, offered me work with the marshals, said they could use a man like me." Mercy's hand stilled in her lap. "You'd have to leave?" He nodded slowly. "For a while. Maybe longer." The fire popped, sending tiny sparks up the chimney. Mercy swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "And do you want to go?" He turned toward her, his expression torn between duty and longing. "I don't rightly know. Feels wrong to turn my back on the chance to make things right again, but it feels worse thinking of riding away from here." Mercy's eyes glistened, but she held his gaze. "Sometimes what's right isn't out there, Kolo. Sometimes it's what's right in front of you." He reached for her hand, his voice rough. "You and Annie, you gave me a life again. I don't take that lightly." Tears slipped down her cheeks, quiet as rain. "Then don't let it slip away." He wanted to promise her he'd stay, that he'd never ride off again, but the storm inside him hadn't settled yet. He stood, his shadow stretching across the firelight. "I just need time to think," he said softly. And for the first time since he'd arrived at Willow Creek, Kolo stepped outside alone. The night wind caught his hat brim, and the valley below shimmered under the moonlight, beautiful, peaceful, and full of questions. That night the valley slept under a silver moon. The wind whispered through the tall grass, and the distant sound of coyotes echoed like ghosts from another life. Kolo stood on the ridge above Willow Creek, his horse saddled, the reins hanging loose in his hand. He'd been standing there for hours, thinking, fighting, remembering. Mason's offer ran through his head again and again. You could be a lawman again. But then another voice whispered, softer, warmer, Mercy's words. Sometimes what's right isn't out there. It's what's right in front of you. He ran a hand over the worn leather of his saddle. This horse had carried him through gunfire, dust storms, and deserts, through a life that had almost killed him more than once. And yet, here he was, alive, standing above a home that finally felt like one. Down below, a faint light glowed from the cabin window. Mercy was still awake. Maybe she was praying. Maybe she was waiting. Kolo sighed and looked toward the horizon, where the sky was beginning to pale into the faintest blush of dawn. Maybe I ain't running anymore, he murmured. He turned his horse toward home. When he stepped inside, Mercy was sitting at the table, her hands clasped around a cold cup of tea. The fire had burned low, throwing soft orange light across her face. Her eyes lifted the moment she heard the door creak open. You didn't go, she whispered. No, Kolo said quietly. He hung his hat on the peg, then knelt beside her. I couldn't, her breath caught. Why? He looked up at her, the woman who had shown him what it meant to live again. Because every time I think of leaving, I see Annie's smile. I hear you laughing in the kitchen. I feel something I never thought I'd feel again. Mercy's eyes shimmered. And what's that? Peace, he said simply. Real peace. Tears welled in her eyes, and she reached for his hand. Then stay. That's all I ask. He nodded slowly, as if sealing a promise with his soul. I will. But Mason's right about one thing. Can't keep hiding from who I am. Maybe I don't need to be a lawman again, but I can still stand for something good here. Protect this valley. Protect you both. She smiled faintly, brushing a tear from her cheek. You already do. Kolo leaned in, resting his forehead against hers. Then maybe this time, I'll stay and fight for something that's worth fighting for. Outside, the first light of dawn touched the mountains. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers through the open window. Mercy whispered, Welcome home, Kolo. He smiled, a rare, genuine smile that reached his eyes. Feels like I finally am. And for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking of the road, or the past, or the ghosts that had followed him. He was thinking of morning, and of the two souls who had brought him back to life. Spring deepened into summer. The fields of Willow Creek shimmered with life. Golden wheat swaying in the wind, the air thick with the hum of bees and the laughter of a little girl chasing butterflies. It had been months since Kolo chose to stay. The valley, once silent and lonely, now sang with the rhythm of a family. Mercy tending her garden, Annie's bright giggles echoing through the hills, and Kolo working the fences with a steady calm that came only from peace long earned. But life, as always, had one last test waiting. One evening, a storm rolled in from the west, black clouds swallowing the horizon, thunder rumbling through the mountains like the growl of something ancient. Kolo was outside securing the barn doors when lightning struck the ridge above. A tree splintered, crashing into the shed where the animals were kept. Mercy's scream tore through the wind. "Kolo!" He didn't hesitate. Rushing through the rain, he fought the storm with every ounce of strength left in him, pulling free the trapped mare, calming the terrified cattle, refusing to stop, even as the rain turned to ice-cold sheets of fury. When it was finally over, he stood soaked and shivering. Mud streaked across his face, but the animals were safe. The fire that had sparked from the lightning was smothered by the rain itself. Mercy ran to him, tears and rain mixing on her cheeks. "You could have been killed!" He smiled faintly, brushing a lock of wet hair from her face. "I've been through worse storms," he said softly. "But this time I had something worth fighting for." She threw her arms around him, sobbing into his chest. "Don't you ever leave me again." He held her close, whispering against her hair, "Never again." "Mercy, I promise." From the doorway, Annie watched them with wide eyes, then smiled, small and pure, before running into the rain to join them. The three stood there together, beneath the fading storm, as lightning rolled away into silence. Weeks later, the valley bloomed brighter than ever. Wildflowers covered the hills, and laughter filled every room of the small cabin. Kolo built a swing for Annie under the willow tree, and every evening Mercy would sit on the porch watching them, her heart full. Sometimes at sunset, Kolo would glance toward the mountains, the old trails, the wild places where he'd once been alone, and then turn back toward home, where Mercy waited with a smile that could outshine the sun. He no longer carried a gun. He carried peace. And one warm evening, as the golden light touched their faces, Mercy whispered, "You found your home, Kolo." He looked at her and said, "No, Mercy. You found me my home." The wind danced through the valley, carrying their laughter far and wide, a reminder that even the most broken hearts can find their way back to love. A journey of loss, healing, and love that proves, sometimes, the right people find you when the storms fade. A lonely man, a brave woman, a little girl with a laugh that could heal anything. Together they turned pain into peace, and a forgotten valley into home. Subscribe for more heart-touching true love stories. Stories that heal, inspire, and make you believe in hope again.